All right, Asa, thanks for joining me today. I know as Bridger, we've been getting a lot of questions about kind of some regulatory uncertainty. There is a lot happening in the world. I know that your news stream has been very busy, a lot going on there. And, I wanted to kind of just ask you some of the questions we've been getting asked from our clients, sit down, have a more kind of casual coffee chat, enjoy some coffee and chat through kind of some of the questions we're hearing and kind of get your opinion. I know I'm no substitute for Ryan Stream's mustache, but I am just here mostly to ask questions and get some answers from an expert like you.
That sounds great, Tessa. I'm happy to talk about regulations. Like you said, there's been a lot going on in the regulatory space. And, without doing a lot of research and understanding rulemaking processes, I can imagine that it's very confusing about what the next 2 or 4 years might really look like in terms of methane regulation. So what I'm hoping we can do is add some clarity to that.
The EPA recently announced a big deregulatory push. What's kind of going on there? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So it was definitely an important press release. They talked about revisiting or reconsidering a lot of different regulations. And within that press release, there were kind of what I think two categories of reconsiderations that they were talking about. They were talking about things that I would consider kind of broad strokes, which would be fundamental changes to regulations, potentially even getting rid of certain regulations, and then some finer strokes. And so these are reconsiderations on regulations where instead of completely changing the regulatory framework, what they're looking to do is actually getting in and surgically changing some of the provisions in these regulations. And, one thing that's really important to note is these sort of broad stroke movements are going to face a lot more legal challenges, right? There's a lot of precedent for these regulations. There's a lot of legal steps that need to be taken before you can just do away with an entire regulatory framework. Whereas the finer strokes, really what those say to me is that there's going to be opportunities. Those are opportunities for industry to continue to engage with, say, the EPA and actually work with the EPA to create a more durable regulation that's more workable for industry.
Interesting. So the EPA along those lines said that they were going to revisit the greenhouse gas endangerment finding. Can you tell me more about what that looks like? What is the endangerment finding? What do we need to know about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the greenhouse gas endangerment finding was really the EPA's determination that greenhouse gases would be regulated under the Clean Air Act, and so that they would start promulgating regulations to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases, et cetera. And that's pretty important because that regulatory basis is the foundation of a lot of additional rules that have been implemented since then. And, when you're talking about different pollutants that could be regulated, there's different categories. There's, say, greenhouse gases. Well, methane is a greenhouse gas. That's how a lot of emphasis regarding methane leaks in the oil and gas industry. And the EPA recently put out a rule called the methane rule that was intended to regulate methane and other pollutants coming from oil and gas infrastructure. Now, that whole point about and other pollutants is actually really important. So what they called the methane rule, which is a set of requirements to limit methane emissions from oil and gas, was more than just a methane rule. Actually, it was a methane and VOC rule, volatile organic compound rule. So that rule served dual purpose in order to regulate both methane emissions and VOC emissions. Now, if the EPA does reconsider the greenhouse endangerment finding or change course on whether that's a regulated pollutant, of course, that has implications for regulations like the methane rule. Now, it's important to note that overturning the endangerment finding would take a lot of work, months to years of rulemaking proceedings. But if that did go through, there's still this additional basis for regulating leaks from oil and gas infrastructure, which is VOCs. And so it's not quite as simple as the endangerment finding gets removed and this regulation goes away.
How would a change like that impact the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, that's an important question. And that remains to be seen, right? I think it's important to understand where we're at and where we could be at. Where we're at today is that there are movements to reconsider these different rules, but the methane rule is in effect. Operators have to comply with that rule. And these reconsiderations, well, if they're minor reconsiderations, we could actually get some nice regulatory wins in the short term. And that could happen pretty quickly because it's not as big of a deal. There's not as many legal hurdles. But in the coming months and probably the coming years, these rules are still going to be in effect. Now, when I talked about those fine stroke opportunities to reconsider these regulations, industry is really actually interested in working with the EPA in these fine stroke approaches to surgically change the provision so that rule is more workable, because industry is favored by a more durable and more certain regulatory framework as long as it's workable for them. So, if they're looking down the road 5-10 years, they want a set of regulations that are effective and make sense. And there's an opportunity to do that. So that might actually be the most favorable outcome for industry.
Interesting. Do you think the industry wants the methane rule to go away as a whole? What have you been kind of hearing from your conversations?
Yeah, in most of my conversations, there's quite a bit of support for the methane rule. There's a lot of aspects of the methane rule. And so opinions are going to be especially split on different aspects of the methane rule, right? There's Quad OB, which regulates the newer infrastructure, and then there's Quad OC, which requires states to regulate the older infrastructure. And opinions vary really a lot based on whether we're talking about Quad OB versus the Quad OC rules. And, overall, I'm seeing, especially with Quad OB, a lot of support for that rule, and specifically certain provisions, us being an advanced methane detection company, providing an opportunity to use our advanced leak detection technology for more efficient compliance. Operators are really in favor of that aspect of the rule and would like to have that opportunity for years to come. And so there's, really broad support for the ability to use advanced technology for compliance options. So a lot of support for those provisions. And in general, especially for Quad OB, less emphasis on Quad OC, but for Quad OB, I've heard a ton of support from industry on that rule staying in place, becoming a durable regulation, but requests for the EPA to take a look at some really key issues for reconsideration to make that rule more workable for them.
So in the current regulatory climate, what are operators thinking in terms of alternative technology? So you mentioned they're able to use alternative technology in this new rule and the new methane rule, which is a big win, both from technology side and operator side, because they can reach these, they can, meet regulatory requirements more efficiently. But how are they approaching this? Do you think folks are kind of changing course at all or trying out different technologies? Kind of what are you hearing from operators on how they're approaching LDAR now?
Yeah, that's a really good question because that's definitely something I've been asked about a lot recently. People are wondering, with this current regulatory environment, are operators less interested in these new compliance options? And I think pretty conclusively what we've seen is a lot of appetite for using advanced technologies for regulatory compliance. Operators have become familiar with Bridger Photonics gas mapping LiDAR over a course of years. They're really comfortable with our performance, what our data is like. They've found that we can help them make their operations more reliable and efficient, save them money, increase site safety for their workers. And so there's a lot of excitement about using our technology for compliance. Also, operators, they want to act in good faith. These rules the methane rule is effective right now. And so operators are complying with this rule and they're building up these compliance programs. And so, they're looking for compliance solutions. And actually, with our technology and advanced technology, I think it provides a lot of benefits, even and potentially, especially within an uncertain regulatory environment. For example, you don't have to spend a bunch of money up front and put a bunch of sensors on your sites. Bridger Photonics maintains and deploys the sensors, and then we provide that leak detection data. So there's not a large upfront cost. Because of the sensitivity metrics of our technology, there's really this kind of one-to-one equivalency with OGI scans that you can use. And so that means, not really having to think about necessarily scaling up the scan frequency at those sites. So it provides a lot of flexibility. And in an environment where operators might need to pivot pretty quickly, having that flexibility, I think, is a major advantage.
All right. This has been really insightful. What are kind of your high level takeaways? If you have a short combo, short coffee combo with someone, what are kind of your big takeaways, things to be on the lookout for of the current regulatory environment? What do you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to understand that there's changes and potential changes happening to the regulations that you cannot control. But certainly in this environment, I think that there's a lot of room for opportunity. And that opportunity is to work with the administrative agencies and voice concerns and get some changes to regulations implemented that make those regulations really workable and effective, to make those more common sense regulations that can withstand the sense of, or that can withstand the test of time and, provide some certainty to oil and gas operators' compliance obligations.
Great. I think that's some really sound advice. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we hop off?
I think Bridger is a really great compliance option. We just got approved for EPA compliance for the Quad OA and the Quad OB rules and the Quad OC model rule. So this is a really exciting time for advanced technology, despite, this regulatory uncertainty that's going on. I really think that we can provide a lot of value through implementing our technology.
Well, Asa, thank you so much for your time today. I think that was really valuable. Quick little overview of kind of what we're seeing in the regulatory world. Maybe we can revisit this again, enjoy some coffee or tea together. Can operators, if they have any questions about regulations, reach out to you, and where can they find you?
Yeah, please do. I spend a lot of time with my nose in the regulatory text, so it's nice to look up and actually talk about what I've learned and share some of that. So yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, add me on LinkedIn, shoot me a message, be happy to talk and, share what I know.
Awesome. Thanks, Asa. Cheers.
Cheers.